Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a capstone project I've been using in the economics capstone, the math econ capstone, and the standard economics capstone course for the last few years. And this was inspired actually by a visit from Robin DeRosa to CIT. She was a keynote speaker there, and she talked a bit about open pedagogy. And specifically, she talked about a textbook that her students had written. And what inspired her to do it was that she was very concerned about rising college costs. And she noted that she was teaching a class in early American literature, and all of that literature was available in the public domain. It was all public domain by then. Was no longer under copyright, and students were paying a lot to get access to works that were all available for free. But what was missing was the annotations and so forth that the Norton anthologies provided. So she thought maybe she could have her students do the annotations of these books. So she had them work with hypothesis and annotate the books and created their own version, roughly equivalent to the Norton anthology, but based on work that the students helped select as well based on their interest. And the students were really excited about it. She had some video clips of them talking about their work. And I thought it might be interesting to try doing some of this in the capstone class. And this is something we offer every spring. One year it's in economics, next year it's for applied math econ students. And we get students in both taking either one. The difference in practice is what types of projects and assignments they do separate from this. Um, and the first day of class begins with the co-creation of the syllabus. So certain learning objectives for the course. It meets some gen ed requirements in terms of communications, in terms of critical thinking and other things. Those are all pretty general. And basically, it's supposed to represent a synthesis of the things that students had learned earlier in their career. So, the constraints are not terribly binding. So the very first day of class, we talk about what the learning objectives for the course are. And then I asked the students that first time if they wanted to try doing an open pedagogy project. And I actually shared a link to a recording with Robin DeRosa, or a podcast we did with her when she came and gave a talk on campus, to see if it was something they were interested in. I said, up until this point, the students did essentially a 20-page term paper, roughly 20-page term paper. It generally was something between 12 and 40 pages over the course of the semester, as well as doing some other projects along the way. They did weekly presentations. But what happened is we take that first day and they decide first what types of topics they're most interested in. We put them up on a whiteboard. It was a virtual whiteboard during COVID, but the other times they're up on the board, and I have the students vote on which topics they most like to cover that semester. And we generally pick 10 to 12 topics as topics that they want to learn more about. And then each week I pick readings for them, and also, well, I pick readings for them, and then they present them in small groups, and we break up into small groups on that first day, typically groups of 3 or 4 students or so. And then I ask them whether they'd rather do a traditional term paper individually or maybe in small groups, or whether they wanted to try using an open pedagogy project. And ever since I gave them that option, they chose an open pedagogy project because they were kind of excited about it. And one of the things that really intrigued them was the fact that they'd have this work project that would last beyond the course, that they'd have something out there online that they could share with their parents, with potential employers, with their friends, to let them know the type of thing that they've actually been studying all this time. So open pedagogy projects are, I think everyone here is familiar with open pedagogy, but basically it's a chance for students to create their own contributions to knowledge, that they're the creators of knowledge rather than just consumers of it. And one advantage of it is that it's a form of authentic assessment, in that students see that they're creating something that has some intrinsic value that may last beyond the duration of the course. it certainly involves some active learning. They're actively creating knowledge, working in small groups, and creating this joint project. It also helps students create and deepen connections with the material because they're writing about it and they have to form those connections. And one of the things that happens is we pick, if they're going to do an open pedagogy project, the next thing we do is we pick the general theme for the topic. That's worked better in some years than others. But when we do the weekly readings, the podcast, oh, I'm sorry, the open pedagogy project generally evolves out of that, because what happens is that when they're picking the topics they're most interested in for the weekly presentations and so forth, that often suggests to them some topics they might want to work on longer. Sometimes they're topics that were not chosen for specific weeks, but often they find a theme there that they can use to build the topic overall. It certainly is something students find a lot more engaging. And one of the advantages of this is it's what David Wiley calls a non-disposable assignment. That, there's so many assignments that students do while they're in college where they write something up, they write an essay, they write a paper, it gets uploaded into the learning management system, it gets graded, and generally they never see it again. And if they haven't kept their own copy of it, when the semester ended, they lose access to it. So they no longer can even keep their own work unless they made their own copies, which of course we all encourage them to do. But the fact that it lasts beyond the course is something that they tend to value quite a bit. It's also something that's a lot more fun for both students and instructors, that when students are writing about something that they pick, that they're interested in, they find it much more enjoyable. And it's also much more fun to read than the types of traditional papers that students often get, where they often choose the same topics or very similar topics year after year with slight variations. There were always some interesting projects along the way, but this tends to get a lot more engagement. And when students are working in small groups on papers or podcasts or other open pedagogy projects, it's much less likely to involve at least traditional plagiarism. With AI, there's still some concerns that it may be used. In fact, I did encourage students to use it for some tasks, such as looking at for weaknesses in their arguments, or suggesting ways of organizing it, or suggesting the structure of the chapters they were working on in this past year. But when students know that the materials they have is going to be posted out there somewhere, they're much less likely to go out and try to find something and just copy and paste it, because then they know it's going to be out there beyond the course, and they wouldn't want potential employers or someone else to find that they were engaged in some academic integrity plus violations. Plus, when they're working in a group, it's much less likely that that would happen than when a student is sitting late at night with the deadline approaching the next day, and they just get desperate and post something. When they have projects that are scaffolded from the beginning of the semester through the end, it's much harder to find papers. I remember years ago, I did have one student who was suggesting a project. This was when they were doing those longer term papers that just did not seem feasible for students given access to the data that they have, publicly available data. And I said, this is an interesting topic, but it's not something that you will be able to get access to because some of the data was confidential, health records and so forth, and it just couldn't be done. I suggested some other things, but somehow each time throughout the semester, he kept coming back to that. He never turned in any drafts. And then he ended up turning in a paper at the end that looked extremely polished. It referred to we as the authors of this paper. And it took me about maybe 30 seconds to find the paper out there, that he had just copied from. And it even referred to in our previous study and so forth. But that's much less likely to happen when students are working with each other and when they're building this a step at a time throughout the semester. So a whole class discussion was used to suggest to either come up once they pick a topic or a theme, the whole class was basically selecting what the chapters would be when they were writing book projects, and that's what they chose most often. With podcasts, it was a little bit looser, but it was interesting because I was always concerned if it was going to converge onto a general theme when they wanted to try some type of a book project. The convergence was sometimes a bit challenging. And some of the themes, as you'll see, were not terribly unified, but in general, they most often they have converged to a general theme that encompass the different types of topics the different groups were most interested in. And then they were split into groups. When they didn't have very strong preferences for which, let me go back a step. The first several times I did this, I did break up students into groups beforehand based on how many previous economics and math courses they've had. And that was used to create balanced groups. And then they selected, and then basically they came up with these topics. And what I did is I gave the groups had a little bit of time to discuss what they want. And we had the list of the topics up on the board. I gave them 10 points to allocate on their preferences for each chapter. So if they really wanted to work on the chapter very strongly, they could bid all 10 points. If they were indifferent between two, they could do 5 and 5. If there's one that they really liked and another they didn't, they might, or there was a second choice, they might do 7 and 3. Or if they were somewhat indifferent, they could just spread it out among the most preferred. And each time I did that, it actually converged. So each group ended up with either their, I think in 2 cases, they ended up with their most preferred chapter, because those who were most concerned about it bid everything. Those who who weren't as concerned, spread it out a little bit more. But no one ended up with something below their second choice. And that there's no guarantee that would always happen, but it did. And each group ended up with one of the top 2 choices. The last couple of times when I've done this, the topics were so different that where there was not the same type of convergence, and there was much more where there would be 2 or 3 students who really strongly wanted one topic and others who wanted others. And we ended up in general I ended up in those cases letting them form groups based on the topics they wanted to work on. And that generally has worked pretty well. And it's been reasonably balanced in practice, mostly because, there's the students who make it through to be senior economics and math econ majors generally have a fairly comparable background. So when it's a book, it's scaffolded. It starts with the discussion of the outline. After we come up with the topics, the next week, the class meets once a week for 3 hours or 2 hours and 45 minutes or whatever. And then the group, well, now that we have the topics, they come up with an overall outline and a structure for that. And the groups for the following week come up with a more detailed chapter outline, which is then shared. This is all done in Google Drive. I create a Google Drive folder for the whole class, and then subfolders for each group where all their work takes place. So everyone in the class has access to the work of the other students in it. The following week, they submit a bibliography. I give them some feedback. It's either a week or 2 between each of these, depending on how much feedback they get in between. But they submit the chapter outline. We discuss it to see if there's overlap. One of the things that happens often is if they're working on on a single theme that is unified in some sense, it's not uncommon for some of the topics to overlap. So we hash out any differences in terms of which chapter, which specific topics are going to go, or whether they're going to modify the focus of those so that it's not going to be repetitive across chapters. Then they turn in a bibliography. I give them some feedback, an annotated bibliography later, and then you get some feedback on that. And then generally it's a couple weeks where they turn it in, I give them feedback, and also the rest of the class gives them some feedback. And then they turn in an initial draft of their chapters. And one of the ways I get the individual responsibility is I ask them to, I could go into the Google Drive and try to track back on what work was done by each, but there was a suggestion by Jessica, she's at SUNY Buffalo, and I can't think of the last name at the moment. But in any case, she was doing a similar project back then. And one of the things she used was just ask students to write their text or to shade their own contributions in a different color, where they put a color map at the top of each of the documents. So one person might be writing in dark blue, one person might be in dark green, one person might be in, a purple or something else, with sufficient contrast to be readable in any case. And that made it pretty easy to visually scan what the individual contributions of each student was. And then at each deadline, when they turn in the draft, I would upload them into Hypothesis, and then the other groups would each provide feedback on the work of the other groups. So if there were 8 groups, for example, in the first pass, group 1 might be providing feedback on chapters 2, 3, and 4. Group 2 might be providing feedback on 3, 4, and 5, and so forth. So they were each providing feedback on 3 other groups. And then in the next stage, they turned in another draft, and I gave them feedback as well, individually as well as group feedback. Group feedback was provided in general in feedback in the grade book. The stuff I put, and individual feedback was put in comments in the grade book too. The second draft, it was a similar process. It was generally, they'd have about twice as much by that point. It was a bit more fully fleshed out. And again, we went through a round of peer feedback using Hypothesis. And the comments that they were giving each other were generally really strong. One of the tendencies some of them had was just to do grammatical corrections. And I suggested that Grammarly could do that, and, or AI tools now can do that pretty well, and it would be better if they focused on more substantive comments. And most of them took that pretty seriously and did provide some really good questions, where they'd have comments such as, this is not entirely clear here. Could you elaborate on this a little bit? Or they'd say, this seems to contradict the point you made a couple of pages back. How do you, could you clarify this difference between these? And I give them similar feedback. But I was generally very impressed by the interactions with the student feedback. And I should note, they were also used to using Hypothesis, because each week the same groups were presenting papers on it. Let's say if there was 8 groups in the class, there would be 8 papers that they would all read for that day's class, and the papers would be shared in advance in Hypothesis, and so they'd be providing comments and so forth. Then each group would present one of those papers to the class, and the rest of the class would ask questions and so forth. And they generally came in pretty well prepared because of the use of Hypothesis in between. Before we had access to Hypothesis, I had them work in discussion forums where they discussed the papers, but the quality of the discussions in there tended to be pretty superficial often, because it would look like people had just read the introduction and maybe the conclusions to the paper, and they hadn't explored the concepts in as much depth. But when it's in Hypothesis, when they're providing comments right on the text itself, it forces a bit more close reading. So it did lead to a higher level of understanding, and students came in much more prepared to participate in the discussion of the chapters each week. And then the final thing was the final draft of this, which was turned in generally the last week of the semester, usually allowing revisions up until final exam week or through the end of final exam week. And then the whole thing ended up getting posted somewhere. Well, I already talked about this a little bit. Okay, and for the book projects, the final content was posted in a Pressbook. And Pressbook is an overlay to WordPress. So anyone comfortable with WordPress can become comfortable with Pressbooks pretty quickly. It would be really nice if students would all have access to that, but getting them up to they were pretty busy developing the actual content. So I ended up doing the actual posting of the material into the Pressbook at the end. And these are the projects. So this has been going on since 2019. This is the first one, income inequality and intergenerational mobility. And this is what it looks like. It has my name there, but what happens is when you get to the individual chapters, it's because I could only put students' names there if they were each individual editors, and then they'd have to learn how to use Pressbooks. And learning how to use Pressbooks was not really one of the main, and this actually describes how this project got started and how it worked. And also a podcast with Robin DeRosa that helped inspire this. But then if we go to the actual content, which is here, each of the chapters, here we go. They broke this first project, they broke down into three broad groups. One was trends in inequality and intergenerational mobility. The next topic was causal factors, things that led to it, and also some possible solutions and some consequences of the income distribution issue. And so, the quality varies a bit. They all end up writing far less than they would have when they were writing individual papers, but it tends to be a bit more polished, and they tend to be much more proud of the work that they've done because of this format. So let's say if we look at economic discrimination, for example, the authors of each chapter are listed at the top of the chapter. We agreed on the general template, the general format. One of the class meetings, usually about 2 or 3 weeks in, they decide what types of font they want, what type of citation formats. One of the interesting things about economics is that every journal has its own citation format. So the way we work with that is most people use LaTeX when writing papers, and there are style sheets for each of those. And if you work with BibTeX, it automatically converts from one format into another. So if you move from submitting it to one journal to another, it just fills in the thing appropriately. Some people use endnotes for the same type of thing. But we decide on that. They usually, each year, that most often they've chosen either APA or MLA. For, I guess, because for other classes, those are the most common ones. I don't really care which format they use, as long as they use it consistently. And we work through what the style would look like in terms of the header structure, how many levels of headers. We talk about digital accessibility. We talk about, copyright, and we talk about images and so forth, and the accessibility of images, the importance of using tags, and the fact that they can't just grab images from articles and post them in. They have to do only things that are either public domain or open source or Creative Commons license, or they can create their own images and so forth with their own equations. And this is what they did. And it's, again, some of the work was extremely good, others isn't bad, but on average, the quality of the writing and the quality of the work, and I think the quality of the experience, was much better than when they were writing term papers that they'd never look at again. And so this is a series of topics here. And there was one, this was a really interesting, this was a math econ one. So students did more econometrics projects and so forth. And one of them did one group in particular, well, two of the groups did some really interesting work. And I'm in the wrong book, here we go. And if we go over to the contents here, this was the one. No, it was the economics of education where, oh, here it is. Yeah, this one. Some of the chapters were just really impressive. I think it was here, the return to education. It was a smaller group, but Katie Blankenship did a lot of the empirical work, and she used data from the American Community Survey. So she was working on a laptop with 3 million observations and running estimates of the return to different college majors and so forth. And it was it was done quite well, actually. Or overall, it was an impressive piece of work, and it was working with some interesting data and challenging data. And there was another study done, another was it the determinants of success? I don't remember. It's a bit of a blur now. Last year, instead of writing books, they chose to do podcast projects, and those podcast projects are posted here. I just got them in this format. Before they were just in Google Drive. I'm gradually moving them all over to this podcast site that I put together for classes, my introductory course. And this time it was a very similar thing, except a little bit more expedited. Each group created 2 podcasts over the course of the semester, and they were often on themes related to the other material. And they're shorter, 19 to 14 minutes, but there was a fair amount of work that went into creating them, editing them, and so forth. And this they really enjoyed. And somewhere out there, there's a podcast that we did with Rebecca and I did with the students who were in that first open pedagogy project. And they talked about how much they enjoyed the project and how much they enjoyed the fact that they had this work that they could share later. And so that's it. This was prepared for a 30-minute session at CIT. So any questions or comments or thoughts?
Have you gotten any feedback post graduation that students are pointing to people to them, or still kind of looking at them, or do you get, or are there any like access tracking or something like that? Because you always hope, you always hope that
I
it's
know.
significant enough that they might point to it, or
I've heard from many of the students, but they rarely have referred back to this. Victoria Heist, who was in the first group, just got her law degree a couple of weeks ago from Buffalo, I think it was. So I followed a lot of the students. A lot of them have added me on Facebook or LinkedIn and so forth, but none of them have really talked about it later. They mostly talk about it that year, that they're linking to their chapters on their LinkedIn profiles, and they're sharing that with employers. One of the students in this class got a job he was doing some econometric work. And he said that having that chapter that he shared with that employer did help him get that position.
yeah. Oh, I think that's awesome. I know the project that I look back on as an undergrad that had the most impact on me, I'm certain I never told the instructor, and I never followed up with him later. So that's not that unusual. But I still think about it every so often, how he ran it, and the fact that it had a product for an external audience, and that those were important parts of it. That's awesome.
A number of my students have presented at either the Eastern Economic Association meetings or the New York State Economic Association meetings, and that's something they certainly valued. And they usually bring their, for at least for the New York State one, many of them have brought their parents there, and and they were really,
yeah,
that was a really memorable experience. And most of them have gone on to grad school after that, and I think that probably didn't hurt. That whole experience was helpful for them. But
now
yeah,
remind me, how big are these classes? I know it's capstone, so it's pretty small.
it's a lot smaller than it used to be. They used to be about 30 to 40 for the seminar courses. But now recently they're a lot smaller because enrollments are down in the major. This past year, there were 16 students.
Oh,
They've
still
broken into
good
groups
size.
before.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the smallest one I've ever offered. So I think I've had up to 40 or so for the seminar, maybe 45 even one time, way back. So yeah, they're not incredibly tiny, but they're like this past year, this was the economic crisis. This was one of those times where they didn't really fully converge on a topic. They just picked a theme of crisis and how it may show up. And let me see the topics here. They only, I should break that up. I did this quickly. The economics of the draft. They started off working on the economics of war, And then they were going off in some strange directions. And they said, well, let's try something different. So it became the economics of the draft, which may have seemed like a crisis at the time, but it didn't quite fit. But then they did one on post-pandemic small business survival, what proportion of firms survive, what types of firms and what industries, which relates to the COVID crisis. Consumer behavior during times of crisis. I don't know where that one came from. I put this together really quickly a couple of weeks ago because they turned it in and I got this out the next day. So I have to go back and clean it up. So this was crisis. This was sort of crisis. This one, not so much. And this one was basically why people are perceiving inflation as being more severe than it is and how it's often occurred. But again, it's not quite a crisis per se. So the theme was kind of
an anti-crisis. Why
an anti-crisis? Yeah.
It's not a crisis when you think it is.
Yes. Yeah. So
excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, it's so much more fun than reading all the individual papers, and they have much more fun with it this way too.
Great. Well, thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Oh, and thanks for having the AI on. It was my first chance to play with it during a meeting as an attendee. So I asked some questions. It was good.
Okay. Which oh, was it the
AI companion? I was asking questions to see if
okay, yeah.
what it was picking up from you.
It's really a nice tool and it's getting better all the time. And that's just otter.ai. You can do that in any meeting if you have an account in Otter. So, and it creates fairly decent summaries. So
great. Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
See you both later.
Bye. Stop the recording. That was kind of quick, but